Thank you so much for coming. Really glad to see everybody here. How many people are new tonight?
I'm new.
All right, good. Well, just a little quick promotion commercial. Just want to welcome everyone, but welcome new people in particular, and want to invite you to participate with some of the things that we do at MRES. We've got a lot of volunteer activities going on. A lot of what you see in the hall is we're getting ready for our eco experience. So we need a lot of volunteers there to help out with that. And we also have the solar tour coming up, where people put their homes on tour. And so it's a great opportunity to learn about solar and everything. By the way, I'm Doug Shoemaker, and I'm vice chair of the board. And I want to get Norm up here as soon as I can, because I think he's just got a fantastic story to tell. The other thing, Laura, catch her with a mouthful of pizza. What? The other thing too, if for those of you that are new, you probably saw when you came in, we normally have it down in the auditorium, but the plant shut down this week, and AC's not working. No one's here working on it, so they were nice enough to get us up here, and where it's a little bit cooler than it is down in that area. So Laura's going to kind of go through quickly some of the stuff that are some of those opportunities that I was talking about, and then we'll get Norm up here.
So I probably already spoke to almost everybody in here, but we're asking, we're doing a membership drive for July, so we're asking people to sign up to be members. So if you're not already a member, it'd be great if you signed up. If you're already a member, it'd be great if you could help us call expired memberships. We would just email you a list of 10 or 20 people with a script, and you could just blow through those and help us with that a little bit. And that, to sign up for that, is right out there. We're looking for volunteers for the eco experience, the state fair. They're 4-hour shifts. You get a free ticket into the fair and a free eco experience t-shirt. So the website link for that is out here too, so you can bring that home and sign up at home.
And a discount for MRES membership.
Oh yeah, you get a $10 discount for MRES, but I don't want you to wait for that. See, that's why I didn't mention it. I don't want you to wait for your discount. But if that's what you need, then you'll get a discount in September. What else? We need volunteers for committees, outreach committee, events committee, advocacy committee, training committee, anything else? Did I miss anybody? Maybe fundraising committee or new committee?
The other thing that we've got that we're going to need some help on is we are going to be building another solar trailer for MRES. And so we'll need some help from people on that, or if people like to do hands-on kind of things, we'll be doing some of that.
And that's all I have right now. So thanks for Dustin. Reminder for me.
I think you guys sent out an email today with a link to the PCA.
Yeah.
Is that volunteer list the same, or is it different, or are they going to get combined? Okay, so you're going to
combine. And your lead list is separate.
Okay.
So I'm going to submit that.
And that might be a good question, that people are volunteering for MRES, but we have them go through PCA, and by doing that, you get the ticket and the t-shirt and everything, and so that helps us make it a better deal for people, and thanks to their help. So.
And we will be doing volunteer training August 24th, and that's generally where you can pick up your t-shirt and your tickets. We'll also be doing a trivia night at the Red Stag in August for volunteers. So it's just a good way to learn about solar and network and meet people. And so we'll get more details on all that later.
Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay.
We're good to go. So I want to get Norm up here, and I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit as far as his background and stuff. But Norm's been part of our solar tour that we do in the fall, and he's got a really, I think, unique application for solar, and it goes beyond that. And so he's got a wonderful story to tell on something that I think could really make quite a difference in Minnesota on crops and things like that. And so Norm, would you come on up and take it away? Thank you.
Well, I am delighted to be here. I was at a MRES meeting probably 25, 30 years ago. I was in the solar business down in Rochester. That was the pre-Reagan days. And I think it was a dinner meeting someplace. So predates a lot of you folks here, I think. My wife and I started the Hazelnut Farm in 2003, buying some land, and we did it because of concern about energy. And I told Doug, I kind of warned Doug, I said, you know, anytime I get an audience behind the door, they get a little bit of the hazelnut and a little bit of the energy story that has driven us, in a sense, to be out on the farm. I've been an activist for a long time in the community. I've written a lot of articles at an op-ed column weekly for a long time on energy and the environment. I go back and read some of those old articles, and deja vu. I mean, the problems are just more real today than they were 20, 25 years ago. I was in IBM education for a couple of decades. I'm a technical guy. I'm not a programmer or an engineer, but I did a lot of education work in the beginning in service and in the end in a laboratory the last 8-10 years, and traveled the US and Europe on new product architecture kind of classes, and had a lot of fun. So, on with the story here. This is a 30-acre site on the edge of Lake City. All of the hazelnuts are inside the city limits, and recently the Minnesota House passed a resolution designating Lake City as the hazelnut capital of Minnesota. Tourism Board was delighted, the Chamber was delighted. We don't know what it means yet exactly, but it has some potential for an excuse for a festival in September, which is kind of a quiet time for the restaurant and lodging businesses there. So our farm, city limits kind of run across like this. This is what we planted, and that's what you saw in the first chart. We planted 1,000 the first year. Subsequently, we've planted here and here. So some of them are just a year or two old, with their heads barely above the grass, and some of them now are 7-8 feet high and strutting their stuff, so to speak. I'll show you some pictures. We built a machine shed, a shop, a root cellar, and a greenhouse, kind of a high-end earth berm greenhouse with what we are a shot at what we call seasonal thermal energy storage, using not such an efficient process of blowing heated air out into insulated storage. And I got a couple of schematics in here later to show you what it was that we did. You know, we didn't have the building up, and I bought a tractor and some accessories. I've always been a bit of a tool freak. And the building was scarcely up, and I bought a skid steer and some accessories. And my wife, she figured it out that this was not about hazelnuts, this was about tools. And, but she adapted really well. So the reason we got interested in the hazelnuts, it goes all the way back probably 30, 35 years ago. I heard a presentation about woody agriculture and how it could address some of the climate change problems by sequestering carbon. Rather than having annual crops, we could have woody crops that put carbon in the ground, in the root systems, and the leaves that they're dropped on the ground and are processed by soil organisms. We were on vacation, and my wife brought along a book that a friend had given us. She'd already read it, hadn't said much about it. We got down to the resort. She says, "You better read this. It'll ruin a vacation." It's a very good book, and it's been updated, and I recommend it to everybody. Because if you don't read this and some of the other books on a little card I'll pass around later, frankly, you don't know what's going on unless you're looking beyond the broadcast media, the conventional print media, and so on, because they really don't want to deal with it, and neither do our legislators at a local or a state or a federal level. They're afraid to death of it. Everybody visualizes the pioneers, those guys with arrows in their back. And you know, the legislators say, go back and educate the public. Well, that's tough when the pipelines to the media are blocking access. So there's a lot of really good, credible websites out there that do address the problems. And I have 4 or 5 of some that I look at every day without fail. And I recommend them to you, and then you can do your own due diligence and decide whether or not you ought to be concerned about it. So anyway, we got interested in hazelnuts because they're 60% oil and because they're perennial. And we got, it's a high value oil and it's a high value protein and rich in a lot of nutrients. Soy only contains about 20% oil, and every year you go through a bare ground cycle. Every year you got to go through soil prepping and planting and germinate a seed and build a root system and build the above ground production system, put on the fertilizers and herbicides and so on, harvest storage and all that stuff. A lot of input for 20% oil. The thing that soy has going for it is that the genetics are really refined and everything ripens at the same time. The beans are all about the same shape. The pods are, you know, consistent for husking purposes and so on. Where hazelnuts have a lot of diversity yet that grow in Minnesota. There's hazelnuts growing in Oregon that are European hazels. They flower there in December and January. They don't do real well here in Minnesota. Ours flowered this year in March because it was a little warm. Ordinarily it would be early April. They are air pollinated, as you probably guess. Okay, so we got a liquid fuels problem. This is one of the minor digressions here. We got a liquid fuels problem. You know, in a couple 100-year oil usage cycle, we're at about the midpoint, maybe slightly past. You could debate it, but we're at about the midpoint. The easy stuff is on the left. The more difficult, more expensive stuff is on the right. There's a reason we're 50 miles, 150 miles out in ultra deep water trying to get oil. It's because we're getting desperate. And when you look at what is going on, there's about 2/3 of the oil-producing provinces or nations on the planet are at peak or beyond. Most of this chart is history. I mean, everything on this chart really is history because it ends at 2010. This is not good news. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. Perennials, low inputs, and all that kind of stuff. This is what they look like this time of year when they're still forming the nuts and kind of filling out. In late August, they're going to look like this. And then, given some success in developing processing equipment, because there wasn't processing equipment for these nuts because of the diversity in size and shape, I developed a nut cracker that'll handle anything from a 1/4-inch hazelnut up to a 1 3/4-inch black walnut, and a sizer sorter so that you can sort them into size classes and then run them through the cracker based on their size class. So that hazelnut oil there sells at Hy-Vee for $10, $9.99. It's about 8.5 ounces. It's a very good salad oil. It can be used for cooking. It's got a pretty high smoke point. The hazels are rated as a heart-healthy food by the FDA because of the high in unsaturated fats. It's used in a lot of products. You may or may not have noticed, but Nescafe has a hazelnut coffee. You've seen those holiday chocolates. We have an organic chocolate French nugget that's produced up in the Twin Cities. I sent him an email a while back. I said, you know, basically the French should be embarrassed by French nugget and having peanuts or something in it. I mean, they don't use peanuts in Europe. They use a hazelnut. I told them I was going to have hazelnuts available to them later this year. You'd get true French. Anyway, if I had 1,200 pounds of kernels sitting on a pallet, a market would be ice cream. That's the kind of quantities an ice cream maker buys for making a run of ice cream, somebody like Kemp's. There's a lot of interest. I get emails from up here in the Twin Cities from some of the restaurants, especially those that are interested in local foods. And they would like to source hazel and hazel oil from within the state. And so that's my objective, is to make them happy this fall here. So anyway, they can be sold in shell. They can be sold as nut meats. If you buy them in the grocery store, they're somewhere between $10 and $14 a pound. They're typically sold in 2-ounce or 4-ounce packets. You can find oil from anywhere from 50 cents an ounce up to $7 an ounce. In fact, I just saw one that's almost $14 an ounce. It's about packaging, guys. And the bottle's pretty, and some French word that most of the folks don't understand. They think it means it's really great. So anyway, there's lots of possibilities for the product in pharmaceuticals. There's been some testing done of the husks. The husks protect the nut during development, and the husks have chemicals on them to kind of make it unhealthy for insects or unpalatable, or for deer, for that matter. I tried biting one of those green husks last summer, and I wanted to toothbrush the inside of my mouth, the skin part, because it's really bitter, really astringent. Yep. But anyway, there's Taxol that's been found in some of these husks. So we can see down the road that they may be grown for biochemical purposes through some genetic selection. And anyway, it could be used for fuel, for mulch, for on-farm biodiesel, and so on. So biggest problem today is there isn't sufficient volumes there. You know, the old argument, you got a market, which has to be there first, market or product. Well, you got to kind of grow both. And so that's where we are in the pioneering stages, so to speak. So, a few words. My wife and I really aren't farmers. I mean, that's not our background, or gardeners much. And so we didn't know much about soils, and we didn't know how complex it was, and how much stuff lives in the soil. I mean, it was just unbelievable what we've learned over the last few years, and it really contrasts with how most agriculture operates and what's happening to the soil we're so dependent on. It's being juiced by chemicals that necessarily produce good food. It's been said for decades that modern agriculture is a process of using oil, changing oil into food. And when the energy supplies begin to go south, as they're about to go, we get food problems. Right now, grain stores worldwide are at record low levels. I mean, we're on the edge of some real problems. Folks don't know that. Probably people pick up the undercurrent of that. Unbelievable the number of gardening, community gardens that are firing up, and gardens that are showing up in backyards, and garden programs at schools getting into gardening on school property. So there's lots of change in the wind, and some of it not explicitly about oil descent or energy descent, but it's related. So these are things that we didn't know about soil. I mean, an ounce of soil can have more organisms living in it than you got people on the planet at this moment. It's unbelievable what healthy soil has in it as compared to the dirt soil as opposed to the dirt that most of our crops are grown on. And, you know, you go out in the landscape here, most of the farmers, if they had to eat what they grow, would starve to death. Because they grow corn and beans, and it's not great corn for food, and it's not great soybeans for the table. Those are industrial inputs. It's really not food per se that you'd want to serve your family. So, a short history. We bought the land in 2003. We subsoil, rototilled, and so on. We put in 1,000 seedlings in 2004. We lost about a fourth of them. Made some frantic protective efforts, fence posts in the ground in August when the ground was hard as rock, and circled it with netting to keep the deer out. We went right through it and paid no attention to the hazels. And so we pulled the stakes out the next year because it seemed like it was ultimately a waste of time. We put in, we mulched everything. We ran a clean field. We know no deciduous seedling likes competition for water or for sunlight or for moisture. So wood chips, we found a local source. We mulched everything. We put in a fertilizer tablet. We put hydrogel to hold moisture because we're in a floodplain, 500-year floodplain. It's kind of a sandy loam soil. Next year, we machine planted 3,000 tubulings, and there was 90-plus degree temperatures and a 15, 20 mile an hour wind, and they were scorched by sunset. And a lot of them died, probably 60%. And in the next couple of years, we did replanting. We injected mycorrhizal fungi spores next to every seedling. My wife did that. Gave them each a 5-second shot of a liquid with some fungal spores, because the spores attach to the roots and increase greatly the amount of contact area between the roots and the soil.
Having trouble hearing you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This only works for that?
Just for the camera.
Okay, well, I can be a lot louder. Thank you for saying something.
I appreciate it.
So one of the things that we ran into was a website called the Sonic Boom website. We play music out there. We're, huh?
They keep zero away, right?
Well, you know, we alternate between the music made for them and polkas and waltzes, you know, and they likes it all. Anyway, we have had remarkable success with our planning, and so we get a lot of people back every year to see if it's keeping on. And so I'll show you some pictures of what's out there today. We've done replacements. We decided that the soil wasn't too good and we should upgrade it, so we planted some manure crops. We tried winter rye. Didn't look like it was doing too good in the fall. When we planted it in the spring, it was kind of spotty looking, and it seemed like in the time I turned around 3 times, it was 3 foot high, turned into straw and headed out, and it was just a total mess. You know, so you got to get it under the ground, and of course there was seedlings this high in them, which you couldn't see from the tractor. So anyway, we spent a couple of weeks cleaning that mess up. We put in hairy vetch because it was recommended by a seed house. It turns out that it's no better than crown vetch, and it went right over the top of the seedlings, and we're trying to shoot the hairy vetch, and it was taking out our hazelnuts as kind of collateral damage, as they say. And so anyway, we had some really fun experiences. That's the fun part. So my wish is that if I had a choice about life, would be that we'd get to live it twice, once to get the experience and then once to do it right. And this is about everything that we do. The whole farm is a big experiment. One of the things that we did was put in some willows and dogwoods, the idea of it being sacrificial browse, because we do know some people who, because of where their plantings are and because of some deer yarding in the area, have had a lot of problems with deer browsing, deer pruning their seedlings. And so we put in some what are called ostrees. It's a hybrid willow that does not propagate, doesn't seed, and it doesn't sucker. And so we just take cuttings off of them and we propagate them on the property, and then have a small tree planter, and we're moving them out around the edge. The idea being that when the deer get to the field, they know what willows are and they know what dogwoods are, and they munch on them and get to the hazel and figure it's not food fit for a deer, because it really is not too tasty. So 2007, we were doing replacement work. We put up some raptor perchers for hawks to sit on and hunt from. We harvested 13 pounds of nuts. Well, this is pretty good. We didn't have to crack many. We didn't have any equipment, you know. So when you're cracking by hand, not many is good. And then the next year we planted, we harvested about 125 pounds. And my best bush in the second year filled a 25-pound onion sack off the bush. And the third year we picked about 900 pounds. And a lot of bushes are only this big yet. And our best bush in the third year filled a 100-pound onion sack. There's a lot of diversity in the bush sizes and in the bush production and in the cluster sizes and nut sizes. And I'll show you some pictures of all that stuff in a little bit. Oops. So, and we, in 2009, started working on the solar domestic hot water system. We put in one 4x8 panel I got a way too much storage. I got a 120-gallon tank, but because I had it from the olden days, and I had the solar panel from the olden days, I said, well, I better use it. So I bought a little 20-watt panel and a little March DC pump and just wired them together. So when the sun shines, it collects. And, you know, it's really super simple. I didn't put a controller in there. And so then 2010, we got into developing some equipment, patent application kind of stuff. I still have to do some wiring for the energy controls on the ventilation system for the seasonal thermal energy storage. We're doing I've done soil testing, we're doing mineral balancing. I still haven't finished the wiring in the root cellar. It's really dark in there without lights. And, we've done composting. I'm a barn cleaner. I get free manure. It's worth it. It's good stuff. You can't believe what a difference it's made in some sandy spots fast. We're playing around with some compost teas. I'm going to the farmer's market and selling hazelnut bushes, not many yet, because people say, well, what is a hazelnut bush to start with? Do they grow in Minnesota? I mean, people just don't know unless they're about my age. I'm pushing 70. I ate them when I was a kid. People my age remember eating them when they were kids. Kids don't remember that. And neither do their parents, frankly. So anyway, one of the things that's a project that I'm starting to feel a little pressure on is a solar dehydrator. Last year we had hundreds of pounds of tomatoes and ended up tilling a lot of them into the ground. We just couldn't keep up. And so the idea of the solar dehydrator is to be able to take seasonal foods and dry them so they're available in the off-season. We could sell them in the farmer's market during the wintertime. Dried tomatoes are really great. And there's a lot of other things that comes out of the garden that can be dried. And so the idea is to use air-to-air heat exchanger that I've got in there to exhaust the high humidity air and bring in outside air, cooler, preheat it, and to use the solar thermal energy storage system that's out there with 8 panels on it as a heat source. And it'll heat it all or heat partial, I don't know yet, because it's all an experiment. This is what the hazelnut bushes look like. It's a kind of a close shot. Those bushes happen to be about 5 to 6 feet high, and you can see clusters everywhere on here. The white flowers are buckwheat, which is a manure crop. You get 2 crops of buckwheat in there over the course of the summer. There's a real fibrous root system, and you just till it in when it gets to about this stage. So it adds humus to the soil. This is what clusters can have anywhere from 1 to 12, 14 nuts. They tend to be larger nuts in the smaller cluster and smaller nuts in the larger cluster. But when you crack them out and aggregate the nut meat, the volume of nut meat is higher in the larger cluster, and the amount of oil there would be higher in the larger cluster. And so, you know, to my mind, the ideal is going to be somewhere between 6 and 8. It's a pretty nice sized nut. And quite, there's a lot of them in there. And I got a picture of a bush I just took the other day. I'll show you. And when they're cracked out, you can see there's quite a bit of variability in the shape of the nut, the shape of the kernel, the thickness of the shell, the uniformity of the thickness of the shell. And some of the nuts have a fairly thick coating on the nut meat, which is called a pellicle, and it's considered undesirable. Hazelnuts that come out of Oregon, which is the only place they're really grown commercially in this country, they blanch the nuts and tumble them to get that pellicle off, because it's sometimes a little bit bitter. Ours, the majority of the nuts have a pellicle that's just about invisible, or it stays attached to the shell. We call these select miniature hazelnuts. And you don't even have to break them up to put them in a muffin, a bread, or a cookie. They're pre-sized off the bush. You see, we turn a disadvantage into an advantage. We also find that some bushes produce nuts that don't fill, and those die. And every fall, when we start looking at harvest time, we go through and look at every bush, crack out 10 nuts, if it looks like it might be a decent bush, and make sure they're filling, and taste them to see that they're not bitter, and see what the pellicle looks like. And every year, we're deleting some of them to get those genetics out of the pollen mix. So we go through later. They're flagged with a yellow flag. I cut their heads off, put a little herbicide on the cut stems, and we put in replacements. Yeah, we keep track of where the bushes are, what row and how many feet into the row they are. There's a lot of fiddling around. There's an example after harvest of what I refer to as a cluster scaffold. Here's when these things flower, there's a little bitty bud right against the last year's wood. And it's about 1/8 of an inch in diameter and about 3/16 of an inch long. And when it's flowering, as it was this year in March, there's just a little bit of pink fuzz sticking out the end. You got to get about 1 foot away to see it. And it's receptive for some weeks. And there's a pollen cloud from pollen drop from the catkins of the other bushes out in the field. They do not self-pollinate, so you got to have multiple gene sources out there, multiple bushes out there that are not clones. Anyway, this bush, the flower would have been here. By the end of the growing season, where the flower is moved out to the end of the stem, and this is where the nut cluster forms, out on the end of that little woody extension. There was a cluster here, a cluster here, a cluster here, a cluster here, a cluster here. There was, out on this branch, there was a cluster every inch, alternating sides. They're pretty incredible. And they don't all do that, and some of them do that and kill themselves making the effort, and they die. And if they don't come back the next year with a crop, then we really don't want them in the field. They can't do what they're out there to do. Bushes that only produce 1 or 2 or 3 nut clusters, not very many, they think they're out there to make wood. That's not the deal, and they disappear from the landscape out there. So that's a picture I just took a few weeks ago. So if you could count here, there's about, I don't know, there's over 30 nuts clusters in here, and these are 6, 8 nuts apiece. There's a lot of nuts in that picture, a couple hundred. That's on one branch, on one bush that stands about 6 feet high. That was the bush in 2008, the best bush, 25-pound onion sack. The next year was a 100-pound onion sack off of a different bush. That was what we picked this year. These green bags here were from individual bushes. These were from 25-pound onion sacks, and they're tagged. We know what bush those nuts came off of. That was what we picked. It's full underneath the scaffold. That's a double row of 100-pound onion sacks. So that's what we got. And frankly, most of them are still in the shell because we didn't have the equipment. So now we got the equipment pretty well along. I got a little tweaking to do with the sizer sorter, and then we'll submit a patent. So, you know, necessity being the mother of you know what. This was a homemade husker. It basically is got a variable speed motor, and it moves a paddle arrangement. There's some expanded metal on the bottom here, and it just beats them up. And they fall through the expanded metal on the bottom and makes a lot of noise and makes some dust, but it does the job. And then we feed them through this contraption, another kind of a jury rig thing, and we just pour the debris into that bucket, and we put a 3/8 inch drill on here, drill motor on there, and it augers them in here. We put a vacuum cleaner on the top, and it sucks the dust and the junk up out of the top, and the nuts fall out the bottom. It works very well. It's very simple. $10 tool, something like that. This is a bush in the fall. It can be attractive in the landscape as a landscaping element. I've had a lot of tours. The garden club came last summer, and they were far more interested in the husks than they were in the nuts as a flower arranging element. Some of them are really pretty, and they look like flowers, literally. Some of them have husks that don't quite cover the nut. Some of them have husks that go an inch past the nut. They have real frilly edges, and they're just a delight to look at. And so Yeah, who knows? They may be in your flower shop next year. So that's the greenhouse. It's about 60 feet of glass by 16 feet deep. The actual greenhouse this way is 28 feet. It's earth bermed in the back about 6 feet. And we're in the process right now of insulating the front with a couple inches of foam. And this is an old Revere panel, a 4x8 panel, and a 20-watt PV panel. Oops.
Whose window product?
Excuse me?
Whose window product? Whose glass?
That was Solarium by, the name will come to me. This happens more and more often as you get older. It'll come back. Anyway, this is the, excuse me?
Write some notes down so you can answer those questions.
I won't forget that one. But,
No,
you know,
it's a good thing to do. My husband and I talk about it all the time. Memory enhancer, write it down.
I always tell my wife, I says, watch, I'm writing it down. She says, that does not work.
Write it down.
You gotta use the other hand.
It's write only. Write only storage. So anyway, what we have in the greenhouse that's still not quite done is a 20-foot double-walled culvert that goes out into the storage. This is all earth under here, and there's about 300 55-gallon barrels, actually about 325. And they run the length of the greenhouse this way. This pipe, this heat exchanger tubes are a bunch of 4-inch PVC pipes that run the length of the greenhouse. I put them out, going out this way just for schematic purposes, but they run the length of the greenhouse and they go out of this header here. And then they, at the far end, they turn, go down, they come back alongside the bottoms of the barrels. So the idea of the barrels is that the convective flow can conduct energy away from those pipes a lot faster than the soil can. We ran the air ventilation tubes right next to the barrels, in some cases under them. And so the idea then is that during the day when it gets up to 95 degrees in here, which tomatoes like, but folks don't, we can pull air off, run it out into the soil, and dump energy in there and bring it back up. Now our hope, our assumption was that we can do it at a rate where we don't cross the dew point. We don't have moisture buildup out there, because that's always a concern when you got piping in contact with the soil. The soil doesn't conduct real fast. And so I haven't really spent much time measuring the relative humidity going in and the relative humidity going out to determine whether or not we might have crossed the dew point back in storage. But typically we're getting 15 to 25 degree drop. So going out there at 90 degrees, I may be coming back at about 80. I wish it was about 3 times the volume. Right now I've got a blower on it, just sitting on a barrel, pointing out into the culvert. And if I run it any faster than low, it pushes itself away from the wall, because there's a little more back pressure there than what just gravity can secure. So anyway, the idea here is that we got insulation over this storage. People say, you're crazy. How can you store energy in the ground when it's 50 degrees? Well, it's only 50 degrees because it sees winter temperatures and summer temperatures, and what you're seeing is soil temperature in the well water or 6 feet down or whatever. It just reflects the average annual ambient temperature. You ask the coal miner or these guys that are looking at oil coming out of this hole in the Gulf, and that stuff is hot. Hundreds of degrees for oil. I mean, they're drilling now where metallurgy is becoming a problem with the drilling bits because of the heat. And so anyway, the coal miners suffer from really high temperatures too in the deeper mines. So anyway, that's the idea there. We got. Are
those barrels filled?
Those barrels are filled with water. They were dipped to give a little expansion space in there, and I put new bungs in them. They're all sealed and individually standing in there. I let one sit out on the ground over winter to see what would happen, and you know, its cheeks got real big, and it tipped over. But when the ice thawed, it went back to its original shape. It didn't hurt it. These are all high-density polyethylene, and they were used in a food processor. They buy their disinfectants and oxidizers and stuff like that in them. First ones I got were from 30-gallon drums from the Prairie Island nuclear plant. I use them for lighting. No, they were listed in the MinTap. If you're familiar with MinTap, and the Materials Exchange, there's a lot of free stuff there, including these high-density barrels. I went up to Rogers one time and picked up about 60 of them.
Why did you decide on 300 of them?
That's about how many I could fit in the space I had and about the distance.
There was no calculation.
This was
behind
not real heavy stuff. And I was pushed for time, and it may be too much. You know, I said, you know, I'd like to live my life over again. If I had my druthers, what I would do, if I was to do it again, would be to go out in the back and dig a hole behind the greenhouse and put the barrels too high so that I don't have so much area to insulate between the ambient and the storage area, because I have pretty significant heat loss from that, even though the barrels are down 4 feet, and even though I've got a few inches of foam insulation and a couple layers of plastic to keep rainwater from perking through and stealing energy. So anyway, theoretically, I got energy storage under the greenhouse, behind the greenhouse, and in the bermed area, and to some lesser degree, there will be out here too. Another question, Sue?
What's your outlet temperature?
It varies with storage temperature. So right now it's about 80 degrees. So my biggest concern with this was, when we started, was season extension. I mean, in February, it can be 0 out or below, and it'll be up to 80, 85 degrees in here. And so I can tuck some of that away, and I can keep the greenhouse from freezing. I can keep it easily warm enough to grow greens in there. You can't get it to a tomato growing kind of a temperature in there. But you can grow vegetables. A lot of them are cool weather crop things. I grow cabbage in there, I could grow broccoli in there, I grow lettuce in there, other kinds of greens, chard and so on. Never freezes in there, even when the system isn't running. It is a double 7/8 insulated glass. And this is inside the greenhouse. We were laying pipes in the floor. When the air comes back under the floor, I only had, you know, I had 10 foot inside and 10 foot outside, because I had to header off lines here, and I headed off lines off the end. So I had to kind of split it. And so that's what you see here, is on the inside of the greenhouse where we start to header off. I bring a pipe up every 6 feet. At the far end of the greenhouse over here, there's like a little apartment we built. It's about 13, 14 feet. There's a bathroom and a shower and a kitchen and a sleeping deck up above the bathroom and so on. So we go from Rochester up to the farm, and we can hang out for some days and be comfortable. There's a second energy system on the place, and these are Solar King panels that got a second life. I had them in a house in a former life. And when they re-roofed it, they got set aside, and some of them were damaged. And I did some experimenting back then too. These were not designed for drain back, but I tried it anyway. And I had some pillowing. If you remember the Solar King panels, they were like a waffle-looking pattern. They were glued, kind of, I don't know, glued together somehow, and then they used the nitrogen high pressure to expand it. So it's an extremely efficient panel, very thick copper, and top rated. But it won't work so good in our weather with drain back. So anyway, I had them, so we spent some time fixing them. You know, you put them back together, just copper, you can fix copper. You know, so they were soldered up and braced and so on. So that's what the solar thermal panels are. I got 8 panels out there. I got a 50-watt PV panel on it, runs a pump that's sitting right out there. I've got a 100 barrels here. Nice round number.
No reason for that number.
Well, I had 100 barrels. And this is just an experiment. And it's insulated. I used to do all these calculations, but you know, when you got weeds in the field and nuts to pick and the 500 other tasks and your wife's saying you're going to die before you finish, you know, it's just, you do what you have to do. So anyway, I have 500 feet of PEX, two 250-foot loops in there at the bottom of the barrels and 500 feet at the top to pull some energy out. And this part I haven't done yet, except this is in the floor. That's to kind of keep it a little more comfortable inside the apartment side. And since I got a separate panel on the water heater, this load is really going to not exist. Instead, there'll be a solar dehydrator on there. So my only load on this thing is the solar dehydrator and then whatever I do with the floor to make the floor a little more comfortable in the wintertime. So the idea then is to make seasonal food available. I mentioned this already. Use minimal energy inputs, blah, blah, blah. So that's what we're doing with those solar panels. And tomatoes now are about 1.25 inches in diameter, and I'm starting to feel the heat and get the dehydrator built. My biggest problem is what do I build the frames out of? I've got the material for building the shelf surfaces, but I don't quite know yet how to build what to build the frames out of. I'd like to not use wood, but I may have to. You know, some other things. You either got fastening problems or you got flexibility issues or whatever. So anyway, that's the array that heats 100 barrels of water that's covered and insulated. And I got a little trim work to do on there to neatenize it for my aesthetics advisor. And that's where we were. You know, it's roughly a 10 by 10 array of barrels, and you can see here where we got 4 lines for the two 250-foot loops. I coupled them above ground, and it's a little hard to see, but they're snaked around the barrels, wrapped around, you know, like this, and snaked back and forth. On the bottom, for injecting energy, and for retrieving it, we did the same thing up at the top, 500 feet of pipe. Maybe it should have been 700. Maybe 400 would have been enough. I don't know. It's an experiment. I tried to get the university interested in getting an intern to help with the engineering, you know, before I got into this. And they said, well, if you have $60,000, we could get you somebody for a couple of years. I said, next? You know, I'm just going to wing it. Well, you know, it wasn't in my budget. We were starting to cover it. The solar storage is out here. You can see where the pipes come up and the array is sitting in the ground here. I kept it about 30 feet away from the greenhouse, so as the temperature went up in the summer, we weren't heating the apartment side. So we're doing things for Hazelnut stand improvement. I already mentioned that. You don't have to beat on that, I guess. There's a number of criteria that we use for selection of who dies out there each year, so we kind of take the bottom end out. Yeah, we have visitors and it's fun. I have some other pictures in here, but the fun stuff, but I promised my wife I wouldn't show them to anybody, especially since you were going to video it. Because, you know, it's mostly funny from some distance in time, looking back. It wasn't so funny at the time. No, so back to my real priority here, which is the energy descent issue. So there's been a lot of papers written. Case Western Reserve has done a study, a scientific organization commissioned by the German Parliament has issued a paper. Doug, how soon is the track door open here? I get just a few charts left. Should I run for it?
Yeah.
Thank you. So anyway, CEOs of oil companies are starting to talk about oil exploration problems. And you got ExxonMobil spending their money on stock buybacks because there's more money in that than in drilling dry holes. People say, well, you know, we could just raise the price of oil and we uncap all those wells. You drive around California, you drive around Colorado, you drive around Texas, Oklahoma, and so on. There's capped wells all over the place. They're just waiting for the price to go up. Well, guess what? Between 2000 and 2008, the price went from $20 to $147. You guess where production went? It was flat, and it's still flat. It might go up a little bit. You can't pump what you can't find. You can't pump what you haven't got access to. So a lot of big reserves that are left, like Iran and Iraq, we don't have access to. This is a chart I thought you should see that was from the Energy Information Administration, Annual Energy Outlook 2009. It also appears in a Pentagon report that's out on the web, the Joint Forces report. And the text in there says, you know, unless something really extraordinary happens with investments, we could be 10 million barrels a day short by 2015. I laid a rule around there, and that's what it is. 5 years is not far from now. It's like tomorrow in terms of infrastructure and what can you do about it. Ethanol, biodiesel is kind of a joke. It's a farm program, and it's good for the rural folks, but it doesn't make any sense. Depending on whose numbers you believe, we could convert all of our farmland, cropland, to beans and corn, and we'd reduce our demand by somewhere between 3 and 15%. It's not the solution. And this one, I thought, how many of you have seen this one already? Okay, this is on the web yet. This is was in the IEEE Spectrum, I think, January 2008. It was put together by some engineers who were saying, you know, we have a real problem out here. Folks can't make a conversion so they can make apples to apples comparisons between different energy sources. A lot of talk about, well, just go to renewables to solve our problem. Well, here's what we'd have to do to replace a year's worth of global oil consumption, or about 23%, say a quarter of it, is the U.S. consumption. To replace that.
How many barrels is that?
Excuse me?
How many barrels is a cubic mile?
No, I don't remember seeing it in the magazine.
I don't remember it, but this is out there yet, along with an explanation and the author's names. But you'd have to build 32,850 turbines and run them for 50 years and aggregate all that energy to equal 1 cubic mile of oil. 50 years worth. We'd have to build 91.25 million 2 kW arrays and run them for 50 years. And that aggregated 50 years of energy production would equal 1 cubic mile of oil. Take a quarter of that for U.S. liquid fuels. We got a problem. I mean, we can use renewables to keep the beer cold, to keep the lights on, but we're not going to run railroads and trucks and cars the way we're running them today with renewables.
They don't have beer.
Excuse me?
Do you know how much cubic mile of oil we need today?
I don't know how much it is. And it was rounded, I'm sure.
Is it like
Eight gallons per
This is 1 year for the planet.
8 gallons.
Yeah, 1 year for the planet. You know, the U.S. today is using about 19.5 million barrels a day at the moment. Between 19 and 20 million barrels a day, 42 gallons per each. So anyway, there's other sources. I won't go into those. You can find it on the web. You go to IEEE Spectrum or send me an email. I'll give you a card with my email, and I can send you this chart. So we're in trouble. We don't have replacements. Demand is rising again. Barrel of crude. This is an example that's used by Roscoe Bartlett. He's a conservative Republican from Maryland. He started the peak oil caucus in the U.S. House. He says 1 barrel of crude oil is the energy content of 12 persons' labor. You know, 12 years for 1 person. Is that cheap or expensive?
I think Sherpa weeks is a better measure because Sherpas work harder.
Yeah, no question about it. Another example I got in another pitch is you can take 1 gallon of diesel fuel and you can run an 80,000 pound truck up a slight grade about I think it's 5 miles. We got a 15 by 18 root cellar. And one of the things I would do if I was to build it again is pre-stressed concrete, poured walls, and so on, so we can take stuff out of the greenhouse in the winter, out of the garden in the fall. And like we took potatoes out, the last ones were in March, and onions in April, kept over winter. And canned goods we can put in there. So it's a refrigerator. I got the ventilation pipe goes out the back at about this height. And so part of the finishing up work is to header those. So there'll be a header on one side, the header on the other side is 15 feet apart, 18 foot deep. And I have power in there, and I'll blow air out and intake cold air. So I'll use ambient air as the refrigerant in a sense, and drive the temperature down into the low 30s is my goal, and then shut off the fan, and then energy will leak back in from below and around this thing, and then the switch will come on, and I'll blow that warm air out, and we'll bring in a fresh batch of cold air, warm it up, and so on. So we'll pump energy out of the greenhouse during the winter. Last winter it got down to 42 without any of that ventilation outside of what might happen from convection and wind blowing on the pipes.
You said you sell the seedlings and so forth at farmers market?
In Lake City, yeah.
In Lake City.
Yeah.
What do you sell? Now you said that you have both bare root and
Yeah,
potted.
the potted are 2-year, and they're about this big, and they're I'm selling them at $10. I sold them on Craigslist for $15. But I'm really interested in getting them in under the landscape. And the hazelnut capital of Minnesota, for people to not know what they are or to have them in your yards, it's just an embarrassment. So I'm trying to change that, and I'm selling them on a radio auction also.
Can you also tell me, it sounds like as a food source, the biggest sort of obstacle is the husking question.
Husking is easy. It's the cracking and the separating of the kernels from the debris.
And that's because they're non-standard sizes. Like I'm assuming that like the Nutella folks in Europe or even the folks in Oregon have got some nice fancy machine that deals with a pretty standardized size nut.
Yeah, I got pictures of that. I went out there and looked at their stuff and took pictures.
So what would you see as the future for, like, let's say that you could get every hedge in the Twin Cities replaced with hazelnut. And I mean, I've seen people who still have, you know, these buckthorn.
Oh, geez, don't give me a headache. Oh.
I've seen it. I'm sure you have too.
We do too.
So if you had like, you know, this nice little city grant program, say, well, you know, here's your grant, $400, whatever. Take out your buckthorn and replace it with hazelnut. Right. And so, like, you actually started developing a source of lots of nuts. You guys got that stuff down there. Other people have got developing farms, and there are people all over the city. So, what could be done to get that?
Some entrepreneur will buy the cracker I built and the nut sizer, and there'll be a little cottage industry, and they can do black walnuts too.
All right.
So it's built. We got thousands of tons of black walnuts in the upper Midwest that go to waste.
Well, you don't want to husk black walnuts
unless
you've got like 5 pairs of gloves on your hands, or you will literally have black hands until you shed off.
It's a very good dye.
Those, So you wouldn't want to. I wouldn't use the same machine to do black walnuts that you do in your hazelnuts. You're gonna have dyed hazelnuts.
Yeah, I probably didn't catch that little subtlety. Cracked versus husk. Husking is easy, but cracking, my machine cracks.
You don't have to roast.
That's the problem. Roasting is an option. So you could call it toasting, but you can toast them in an oven for 275 for 5 minutes or so, and it changes the flavor. Yeah, but we eat them raw. We put them in oatmeal every.
Do they keep though?
Huh?
Do they keep?
Out of the shell, they'll keep for about. Out of the shell, they'll keep for about a year. If you put them in the freezer, that extends the life a lot. They get rancid in the presence of oxygen. They're pretty well protected. If they're inside the shell, they'll last a couple of years.